Welcome to the very first inaugural episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. So glad that you chose to join us here today for this first episode. I am your host, Erik Bjornstad, and I am your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. So the Fuel Pulse Show is for anyone who uses fuel, anyone who has things that use fuel, whether at work or at home, anyone whose job means taking care of fuel so that it's there to help them get the job done, whatever that job may be. If you think that any of that sounds like a little bit like you, then the Fuel Pulse Show podcast is going to be for you. So just a tiny bit about me. In my day job, I am the technical director for Bell Performance in Longwood, Florida. It's a company that's been in the fuel petroleum treatment business for over 100 years now. I myself have been in the particular industry for 15 going on 16 years. And one thing I've learned in that period of time is that there's always something new to learn every day. That's one thing you'll find out about me as we take this journey together. I always like to learn new things. And so these days, that means that I listen to a lot of podcasts because there's really so much good content out there on so many different things. And so now we are dipping our proverbial toes in the water and kicking off this new podcast, the Fuel Pulse Show. So this being our first episode, this is our chance to introduce the podcast, talk a little bit about what you, the listener, might expect from this podcast in the future. And so the question before us today that we want to fill in the gaps on is, why should you care about this podcast in particular when there's a lot of podcasts out there for you to listen to? Well, to help us figure all of this out, I am joined by our very first guest on the Fuel Pulse Show, Glenn Williams. Glenn is the president of Bell Performance and has been in the fuel treatment business himself pretty much his whole professional life. So, Glenn, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Erik. Glad to be here and looking forward to it.
Great. So, Glenn, to kick things off, why don't you tell the listening and the viewing audience, with all the content out there, why did we think that people might be interested in something like the Fuel Pulse Show podcast? If you want to tell them a little bit about why we wanted to start a podcast like this, or even better, why the market needs a podcast like this.
Yeah, it's a great question, Erik. The podcast today, like you have experienced yourself, it's a great way to become educated on a topic you don't know much about. It's a great way to see differing opinions on things. And we've been doing this for over 100 years, fixing fuel, doing things like that, and treatments and all kinds of stuff, helping work with all kinds of customers. And we feel like this is a great opportunity for us to get the word out even more about issues, challenges, benefits, whatever fuel-related issues and questions people have. We're here to do that. In fact, that's just a natural extension of our core mission here at Bell Performance. So this is a natural fit coming onto it, doing it this way. And I'm looking forward to see how many people we can reach with this podcast and help people solve problems. That comes down to the end deal there. We just want to make sure that we help people where they're at.
and talking about solving problems for fuel and giving people information. One thing I mentioned this a little bit earlier. There is it seems like there's a podcast for almost anything nowadays, and that's really good because many of those podcasts, they really help to get information out to people who might not hear or learn about that otherwise. And I think, and Glenn, I'm sure you'd agree, that the people that we're talking about in the industries that use fuel, there's just so much that even seasoned industry professionals that have been dealing with fuel for decades, even, they may not know as much as you might think that they do. And so my perspective is that one of the goals for the Fuel Pulse Show podcast is to give everyone listening, at least in each episode, at least a little nugget of factual information that makes them say to themselves something like, well, I didn't know that. Maybe I need to learn more about this.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. And I think that even extends to these groups that of people that, maybe they're an expert in their own right, in their own industry. We were talking just earlier about
Hmm.
electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, could be very competent in that. But when some of the things that are like if somebody's servicing a generator, they really need to know all of the components and how to service that generator properly. They also need to know about the fuel because that's a secondary item that can really affect whether that generator performs like it should or not. So, yeah, we're here to raise the bar and help everybody we can to have a better
Yeah,
understanding.
absolutely. And talking about that person, that generator service professional, um, one of the things I think we've seen is, yeah, they may be experts in fixing generators and diagnosing the mechanical issues and getting that generator back up and running, but they may not necessarily be an expert on what the fuel does and how to take care of the fuel that generator needs to run. And so I think when you frame it like that, I think that uh, there can be misconceptions, I think, about fuel that even seasoned industry professionals have. So, Glenn, I might throw out to you, given that you've been in this industry, what people might call the fuel additives or fuel treatment industry for your entire career. Um, what do you think is the biggest misconception about either about fuel or about fuel treatments? What's the biggest misconceptions about those that you would want to clear up if you could?
Yeah, the top one that comes to mind, Eric, is the misconception that people think, well, once I buy fuel and put it in to usage for what I want, whether it's stored fuel or whether it's fuel for your
Hmm.
vehicle or any of those things, um, for people just to say, oh, well, it's in there, it's going to work fine, there's never going to be a problem, and they just go on and do whatever else they need to do. Now, fuel in a lot of circumstances does meet the needs and what have you when we do it. But the misconception that I never need to do anything else with my fuel, and we've seen that a lot. People stick fuel in a storage tank,
Hmm.
backup generator or some other storage capacity, and they let it sit for years and years and years, thinking, hey, if there's ever an emergency,
It's going to
that
work just
generator is
fine.
going to
Yeah.
work for me, or that fuel is going to be ready. It's going to work, yeah, without issues. And what we're finding is that is not the case. Fuel needs to,
Needs to
you
be
have
taken
to
care of.
test it. You have to, that's right. You have to, do the things just like with your health. You can say, hey, I bought this gym membership and everything's going to take care of itself. But you actually have to do things, be proactive with that. Now, fuel, of course, there's a lot of ways that you can help make sure the fuel is going to operate in the best way possible for you. And again, that's what this podcast is about.
Yeah, and I think also from the formulation standpoint, which is tends to be where I operate from. One of the things I notice that if you're talking about misconceptions that someone like me might want to clear up, it's I think the misconception that there's no fuel additive that does anything or does anything worthwhile. And unfortunately, the industry only has itself to blame for that because of, shall we say, playing fast and loose with things over the decades and really, over the centuries, ever since the early 18 or late 1800s when fuel started being used. Um, there when you talk about people thinking about the fuel additive industry, of course, the terminology they use, they talk about snake oil and that it's all snake oil and none of it does anything. Um, and so what I would say is that, yeah, there's a lot of snake oil out there, if you will, but if you talk to the people in the on the business side, the B2B section, if you will, the people who manage fuel and have a lot of writing on it, they know that there are, legitimate chemistries out there that have been developed over the years by, pretty smart petroleum chemists that do actually work and do actually do specific things. And so that's one thing I think that we'll talk about over the episodes is, what those things are and what they actually do, but then very importantly, what they don't do. Because Glenn, I'm sure you'll agree there's been a lot of problems in the industry with things being misrepresented, uh, claims being made that are not really supported by the science or by the evidence, and unfortunately, the industry I think has suffered. Wouldn't you agree?
I agree wholeheartedly, and some of these things were started just they were claims made that you think that there's a good foundation for it, but when you look at the evidence, it's not there. And so, but it just gets circulated more and more and more. So, we want to make sure that we really get the facts straight and make sure that, our answers line up with science and what we're finding when we test and experiment and, use the scientific method.
So, Glenn, with how long you've been in the industry yourself, I'm sure you'd agree that you've seen a lot of changes that have happened over the years. Not just new chemistries and things that have come, but on the fuel side, you've seen a lot of changes with the fuel itself. And I think it would be safe to say that fuel problems, quote unquote, fuel problems are getting worse, worse than they used to be. So, Glenn, what have you seen with respect to that? How has fuel changed? And why, if someone asked you, why should that matter to the people who have to manage and use the fuel?
Sure, sure. Well, you have, a lot of changes to the fuel over time. You pick any fuel you want, and fuel has been changed and reformulated. And we have
Hmm.
legislation, for example, that basically requires fuel to undergo certain changes, so that certain things are removed from fuel. And there's other changes that happen because with the usage of fuel, a good example is like
Hmm.
microbes. Microbial issues have really arisen in the last 2 decades, more so than what we were aware of before. And there is no slowing of the curve on that. It continues to be a growing issue and concern, so much so that one of the things they're finding is these tanks that they store fuel in, these steel, tanks and what have you. You can really limit the shelf life or the
Hmm.
lifetime expectancy of those tanks. So what we're talking about is, what was considered a 20-year investment, you can start having damaging issues within 5 to 10 years that can cause leaks and all kinds of corrosion and things like that. And so, that's kind of what we have seen. The additive industry has had to adapt to the changing world of fuels, and it continues to change. So we continue to be testing and checking and learning about what is Congress requiring, and what are the different fuel standards out there. What happens to
Hmm.
your fuel in summer? What
Yep.
happens in winter? These kind of things. We have to keep on top of that, because that does affect performance, in the short term, and also stability in the long term, as well as many
Right,
other
right.
factors.
And when we consider this issue of how has fuel changed and whether it's changed for the better or for the worse, it's just a fact of life. I think that there are particular industries where those changes really have had a disproportional impact. I mean, Glenn, you talk about things like what hospitals, what we would term mission critical entities, and when we say mission critical, we're talking about entities that use stored fuel that serve a really important civic or private function. So, like a hospital or healthcare facility, obviously, they're required to have backup fuel, and they're required to maintain it of a certain quality because if they lose power, they don't want people dying on the operating table because they didn't have any power. Um, Nowadays, you talk about from the technology standpoint, cell companies and data centers, that's mission critical. And all of those use stored fuel.
Yep.
And yet the fuel itself, the stored fuel, the properties have changed. The fuels degrade faster. And like Glenn, like you just pointed out, the microbes microbes grow in fuel a lot faster than they used to. Um, and so I would say one thing that we have noticed here at Bell with how we've been looking at the industry is that people really need to know, people in the industry really need to know more about how the fuel isn't the same as it used to be, and then what are the things that they can and cannot do about it. And so that's, I think, one of the things we're going to aim to talk about and communicate in various episodes is what are the useful things that, you, the audience, as a fuel professional, may want to consider. Or if you have a problem, right, Glenn, if you have a problem, what to do about it.
Right. Absolutely.
So, Glenn, would you, if we say that fuels have changed, is it safe to say that the solutions, or the approach, maybe I might say approach, the best approaches to keeping that fuel viable or solving problems, uh, have those changed as well?
Yes, absolutely. Technology has improved our way of life in just about every way imaginable. And with fuel treatments, best ways to, test fuel and monitor it and keep ahead of the curve. I would say that fuel maintenance has changed immensely. Again, we're finding new ways to do things better, easier, more cost effectively, keeping fuel stable and keeping it viable and everything else. Eric, one of the things you talked about in the last answer you were giving too, you said you touched on the mission
Right,
critical,
right.
uh, you know, different usages of fuel. And so, hospitals, healthcare, data centers, 911 operations centers and call centers, emergency operations centers when there's hurricanes or other major disasters, things like this, hospitals, even like surgery centers and stuff like this. The growing challenges have been how do we keep ahead of this, and one of the ways is there have been mandates on some of these critical industries of what has to happen and how resilient they have to be in case the power goes out. And that's not a bad thing, but certainly just telling somebody you have to meet these requirements and not telling them how can also be very frustrating. So that's one of the things that we like to do is partner with groups that are tasked with having to maintain this standard no matter what, but not knowing exactly how to do that. And so, that's something that we can help with for sure.
Yeah, and I think that when we talk about how you mentioned fuel management, and I think that one thing, if you talk about how things have changed uh, now versus 20 or 30 years ago, um, the the best practices that go into fuel management really, I think, are different and more comprehensive than they used to be, and I think that speaks to the truth of the matter that because fuel properties have changed, because they're more prone to problems, people in the industries use them have to pay more attention, and they really have to start treating fuel as something that they have to manage and something that they have to maintain. They have to do fuel maintenance. That's something that we definitely have seen in the industry. And yet, when you talk about things that industry professionals may not know or may not consider, that's probably a big one, is the fact that people who have been in the industry for years and years and years and are used to doing things a certain way, they may not realize that the stored fuel, they can't treat the fuel that they have the same as they did 10 or 20 years ago. Um, and so that's definitely something I think that we're going to talk about a number of times on the Fuel Pulse show, is how the best practice approach to fuel management, it's different now than it was in times past. And that means you have to approach it differently and you have to consider different solutions if you've got certain kinds of problems that rear their head, so to speak. So Glenn, as far as speaking to what you might want to say to our listeners who are going to be tuning in to the Fuel Pulse show. Um, if they were to ask, what should I expect if I were to tune into a future episode, what would you say to them?
Well, I would say, the overarching theme is we are going to help them understand the ever changing world of fuel. We are going to be having a number of different guests
Mhm.
from different industries, different walks of life, different backgrounds come and we're going to, discuss with them what are their challenges, what are their issues, what have they found that works, how can they benefit our audiences with some of their words of wisdom. And so that's what we're expecting to do is just raise the level of education out there, help people right where they're at. So our goal is to get enough of these podcasts done so that we're going to have a wealth of knowledge that people can just go and choose their topic. Hey, my fuel's doing this. This is really a problem, and I'm this kind of person. I'm an engineer that does this, or I'm a plant manager that does this. They'll be able to go find that easily and get the answers and the resources they need. So that's kind of what our expectations are for this show.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that we're aiming to do with the Fuel Pulse show is, we want to have guests on that have something useful and interesting to say about a particular aspect of fuel itself or fuel management or even the ways that fuel are used. Um, and it's hopefully each episode is going to have some interesting things that somebody who has a problem or is charged with preventing problems with their stored fuel supply or their fuel usage, they may, they'll learn something new that they can take away, and not just in their professional spheres but also in their personal lives as well, because we all drive cars and trucks, right? And we all, some of us,
Yep.
especially down here in Florida, we have generators that need maintaining, and so sometimes I think we'll touch a little bit about things like that as well. So, um, typical podcast shows are going to be usually around 20-30 minutes long. And so that's really the goal, I think, of the Fuel Pulse show is to uh, pr- uh, produce something, have something useful to say, I think, for people in the fuels industry and for people who use fuel. So, Glenn, you got any final thoughts on this first episode of the Fuel Pulse show?
Yeah, I would just say, hey, if people have questions, please get in touch with us with your questions because that's one of the things we want to do is get people's questions and answer them. And let me just give a little bit of a caveat too. We're not going to be evaluating different specific products
Mm-hmm.
or anything like that. That's not the purpose of this show. So you write in and say, "Hey, this is the additive I'm using? Is it any good?" That's not our goal with this. Certainly, if you're being proactive, that's a great step in the right direction. There are a lot of resources out there to help you determine what's the best treatment to use and what have you. But from an all-encompassing perspective, we're going to kind of give you next steps, maybe to fix your problem. And so that's why we need to hear from you. If you've got problems you're dealing with, especially fuel-related issues like that, we need to hear from you, and that way we can kind of address those in future
Well, yeah, and Glenn,
podcasts.
you raise a good point because when you talk about discussing specific products out there or promoting certain specific names over other names, yeah, I definitely agree. That's not what we're aiming to do here at the Fuel Pulse show. One of the things that we at Bell Performance have tried to do over the years is we've really tried to be a resource for people, and a resource that people can trust, where they're going to get the best information and the correct answer, or the best correct answer for their problem, without worrying about, are these people just telling me something so that I'll buy something from them? Because, Bell Performance, obviously, we are in the fuel treatment formulation business, we're in the service business, but that's not our aim at the Fuel Pulse show to promote ourselves. What we are aiming to do is give people in the industry and whoever's listening to this show, give them the best information, the most correct information for whatever it is that they're dealing with. That's what we've always tried to do in our regular business practices, and that's definitely what we are going to be trying to do here. So,
Yes.
last question, Glenn. So, in honor of you being the very first guest of, hopefully, first guest of many on the Fuel Pulse show, the essential question of the day to cap this off is, I know that you are a reader, so to speak. So, Glenn, what books are you currently reading?
That's a good question. So the book that I'm currently in the middle of right now, and it's a great book. I have a couple of books that I have stashed away that when I get time to read, I'll grab and read. The one that I am in the middle of right now, and it's very fascinating. I love it. It's called Relentless by Tim S. Grover. And it's just a fantastic read. If you know anything about Tim Grover, he's a trainer to the stars,
I mean,
to
like,
the star
athletic
athletes.
trainer.
Yeah, he's athletic trainer, yes, and he just has a remarkable track record of some of the greatest superstars working with him, in the basketball industry and what have you. So, anyway, this is kind of if you ever wondered, like, what does he think of? How does he put people and characterize them, based on what they're doing and when working with them? He breaks things down in this book, and it's a lot of information, but it's a great read, and it's really good to kind of form your understanding of what it takes to really be a successful athlete and a superstar athlete for that matter. And of course, most notably, he was the trainer of Michael Jordan
Well, what does he
and all
know
that,
about
but a
it?
number of others as well. So what does he know?
So, definitely a book that you would recommend, right?
Yes.
Well, Glenn, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us for our first episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. Thank you for sharing your experience and your perspective and your expertise with us today. And to you, our listening audience, thank you for spending part of your day with us during our very first episode. Check the show notes at our website for links to everything that we talked about today. Those are located at www.bellperformance.com. Please make sure to subscribe to this podcast at iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you prefer to get your podcasts from. And then, last but not least, if you liked what you heard today, then please leave us a review at your preferred site, because that is one of the best ways that we can get the word out to other people. So once again, thank you very much for joining us, and see you next time at our next episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.